Saipan, July 1944. The sun rose hard and merciless over the island. The air shimmered above the sand. Heat so heavy, it bent the horizon. American engineers had scraped out a rough camp beside a ridge of volcanic rock. Barbed wire, canvas tents, and the low hum of diesel generators filled the morning stillness. Inside the wire, a line of Japanese prisoners stood motionless. Their uniforms were torn, salt-stained, faces hollowed by weeks of fighting. Many stared at the ground, refusing to meet the gaze of their captors. Then came a smell. Rich, bitter, unmistakable. A field cook ladled steaming coffee into dented metal cups, the liquid almost black against the white glare of the desert sand. American soldiers drank quietly, some offering the same tin cups to the prisoners. The prisoners hesitated. Coffee? Hot in this heat? In the middle of nowhere? It was beyond comprehension. No one spoke. The sound of the sea far away, the clinking of canteens, and the slow realization that this enemy was sharing comfort, not cruelty. A strange silence settled. It was not surrender, not victory, something human, fragile, uncertain, standing between them. To understand this moment, we must look at the world that made it possible. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had turned into a campaign of exhaustion. From the jungles of New Guinea to the volcanic rocks of the Marianas, the Imperial Japanese Army was being pushed back, island by island, mile by mile. What had begun in triumph in 1941, with Japan sweeping across Southeast Asia, was now unraveling in fire and hunger. The islands were small, desolate places, chosen not for comfort, but for strategy. Saipan, Guam, Tinian, names that meant nothing to the civilians back home, were everything to the men who fought there. Whoever controlled them would control the sky above Japan. The Japanese soldiers knew it. They were told to die before surrender. Their code, Bushidō, was absolute. Honor above life, obedience above reason. To be captured was to disgrace one's family and the emperor himself. Many Japanese soldiers carried a single bullet or a grenade, a promise that they would never fall alive into enemy hands. For American troops, it was a different kind of war. They came from farms in Kansas, streets in Chicago, small towns in Oregon. They carried not the ideology of empire, but the machinery of industry. Behind every rifleman on the beach stood the world's largest logistical operation. Fleets of ships, trucks, cranes, fuel depots, and field kitchens. The American Army could feed a division 3 meals a day in the middle of a wasteland. They had mobile bakeries, refrigeration units, and canteen trucks capable of boiling water for thousands of men. It wasn't luxury, but it was order. It was civilization projected into chaos. The Japanese, by contrast, were starving. Supply lines had collapsed under U.S. naval bombardment. On many islands, soldiers lived on a handful of rice a day, mixed with weeds or coconut shavings. When the Americans landed, they often found enemy soldiers skeletal and fevered, still clinging to discipline, still saluting with trembling arms. Surrender, when it happened, was not just military defeat, it was spiritual annihilation. For those captured, shame was unbearable. Some tried to provoke guards into shooting them. Others refused food or water. Yet, in these same camps, something remarkable began to occur. Moments of quiet humanity that defied the logic of war. The Americans, trained under the Geneva Conventions, treated prisoners with procedural care. They disarmed them, registered them, provided food and medical attention when possible, not out of sentimentality but policy, a pragmatic understanding that order, even in war, was power. A fed prisoner was a cooperative one. A humane camp was a source of intelligence and moral high ground. Still, for the Japanese, These gestures were unthinkable. They had been told Americans were barbarians, men who mutilated captives and burned villages. So when, in a desert camp under the Pacific sun, an American cook handed a steaming cup of coffee across the wire, it shattered that mythology. But this small act didn't emerge from nowhere. It was the product of a massive logistical miracle. The U.S. Army's ability to bring comfort, warmth, and routine into the most hostile corners of the world. And at its heart stood a single, humble symbol, the canteen, a soldier's companion from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Burma. A small vessel that could hold water, soup, or, when the fuel allowed, a measure of coffee strong enough to wake a nation at war. To understand why that mattered, we must step deeper into the machinery behind it, the system that made hot coffee possible in the middle of nowhere. The American soldier's greatest weapon was not always the rifle. It was the supply chain behind him. From the moment the United States entered World War II, the Army Quartermaster Corps and the Transportation Command became engines of efficiency, unlike anything the world had ever seen. While Japan's armies fought with dwindling supplies and fractured communication, the U.S. military built a global network of warehouses, convoys, and mobile kitchens. Fuel, ammunition, uniforms, medical kits, and even fresh produce flowed through this system like blood through a living body. But among all the items shipped across oceans and jungles, one stood out for its consistency and symbolism: coffee. In every ration pack, from the M unit to the C ration, there was a small brown envelope of instant coffee, sugar, and powdered cream. It wasn't a luxury, it was morale in a cup. For American troops, coffee meant civilization, warmth, and routine. It could lift spirits at dawn before battle, steady nerves after shelling, and remind a man that the world he fought for still existed somewhere beyond the smoke. To make that possible required astonishing ingenuity. Portable stoves, small enough to fit in a truck but powerful enough to heat gallons of water, were developed and standardized by the Quartermaster Corps. The M1937 field range, the M1941 cook stove. These were the unsung heroes of the front. Fueled by gasoline or wood, they could boil coffee in minutes, even under rain or artillery fire. Water, too, had to be purified. Army engineers carried chlorine tablets and mobile filtration tanks, ensuring that every canteen could safely hold drinkable water, a luxury many enemy soldiers lacked. In the Pacific heat, dehydration killed more quietly than bullets. The ability to drink, to hydrate, to share water, that was life itself. This infrastructure did more than sustain the U.S. military. It shaped its moral identity. Commanders like General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz understood that discipline and humanity were linked. Feeding troops, caring for the wounded, and treating prisoners decently were not distractions from war. They were proof of strength. In contrast, Japanese military philosophy saw comfort as weakness. Their soldiers were trained to endure hunger, thirst, and pain without complaint. Rations were minimal. Amenities were nearly non-existent. In that environment, the sight of an American canteen steaming with coffee wasn't just surprising. It was disorienting. Captured Japanese officers later wrote in their memoirs that the Americans' ability to eat, rest, and drink hot coffee under constant combat was an unnatural thing. To them, war was supposed to erase comfort. To see the enemy maintaining it and sharing it felt like witnessing a civilization immune to despair. Behind this gesture lay deeper strategy. The United States wanted to win not only through firepower, but through example. By treating prisoners humanely, they aimed to undermine Japan's propaganda that painted Americans as monsters. Reports from camps were carefully recorded. Interrogations revealed that many Japanese soldiers, after being captured, expressed confusion, even shame, at their previous beliefs. And yet, the image that endured most powerfully wasn't one of interrogations or paperwork. It was that quiet moment when American soldiers, surrounded by dust and silence, poured black coffee into tin cups and handed them through the wire. The steam rising between enemies, the desert heat meeting human warmth, and a realization, fleeting, fragile, that war could not fully erase decency. But this moment was only one thread in a much larger tapestry of emotion, technology, and morality colliding on the battlefields of the Pacific. To truly grasp its meaning, we must view it through several distinct lenses: human, tactical, technological, and cultural. To understand the silence of those Japanese prisoners, one must understand the collapse of their world. For years, they had been told that capture was worse than death. Propaganda leaflets, military instructors, even their own comrades repeated the same message: an honorable soldier does not become a prisoner. So when the Americans found them, gaunt, trembling, covered in dust and sores, these men were no longer soldiers in their own minds. They were ghosts. They expected cruelty. They expected mockery or execution. They expected to be treated as less than human. What they received instead was organization, calm voices, medical aid, and then coffee. For many, that first sip marked the beginning of a long psychological unraveling. Some wept silently, unable to reconcile the gesture with everything they had been taught. Others refused the cup, believing it was a trick. But eventually, hunger and exhaustion broke the wall. The coffee was hot, bitter, real. In that moment, the war became personal. Not the clash of nations or ideologies, but a confrontation between two human beings, one pouring, one receiving. No words, no orders, just warmth in a cup, and the realization that the enemy was human too. War tests not only courage, but conscience. In the Pacific, where atrocities were committed on both sides, morality was not a given. It was a choice made daily, often in silence. For the United States, the treatment of prisoners became a moral frontier. Officially, the War Department mandated strict adherence to the 1929 Geneva Convention. But beyond legal obligations, there was something deeper at play: the belief that decency could be a weapon. American commanders understood that humanity was not weakness. It was influence, feeding prisoners, offering medical treatment, even allowing them small comforts, created a psychological contrast that reached beyond the camps. Captured soldiers often spread these stories through rumor, through interrogation, through letters that eventually found their way back to Japan. It was a subtle kind of warfare, moral propaganda by example. Each humane act undermined the enemy's conviction, planting doubt in the unbreakable code of Bushidō. Still, not all soldiers agreed. Some, hardened by the brutality of the Pacific Campaign, by Pearl Harbor, Bataan, Tarawa, saw kindness as betrayal. There were men who refused to share their rations, who spat at the prisoners' feet. But military discipline prevailed. The American ideal, as imperfect as it was, demanded restraint. In that desert camp, when an American cook offered coffee to his captives, he was not thinking of diplomacy or propaganda. He was thinking of fatigue, of habit, of decency. A soldier himself, doing what soldiers do, sharing the one thing that made the day bearable. That is how morality often operates in war. Not through grand speeches, but through small acts that quietly preserve our humanity. Behind every act of humanity in war lies a structure of power. Machines, methods, inventions. The ability to serve hot coffee in a desert was not luck. It was technology. The U.S. Army's field kitchen was one of the most advanced mobile systems of the era. The M1937 field range, a steel unit about the size of a desk, could boil, bake, and fry anywhere, from jungles to coral beaches. It burned gasoline or wood and came equipped with folding legs, heat shields, and multiple pots. It could feed 200 men per meal, and when necessary, it could brew gallons of coffee in minutes. Each unit had trained cooks, soldiers in aprons, often overlooked, yet essential. They worked through the night, rationing flour, stirring pots, keeping morale alive with the smell of food. Coffee itself was a marvel of supply. Dehydrated crystals, vacuum-sealed, ready to mix with any water, pure or filtered. In 1944 alone, the U.S. shipped over 250 million pounds of coffee to its forces overseas, enough to fill entire cargo holds. In contrast, Japanese rations consisted mainly of rice, dried fish, and pickled vegetables. Coffee was virtually unknown among common soldiers. The difference was not only nutritional, it was cultural. The American Army carried its comforts into war. The Japanese Army left them behind. That divergence shaped everything: discipline, morale, even compassion. When an American soldier poured coffee for his prisoner, it was an extension of the same system that brought that coffee thousands of miles through oceans and jungles, the triumph of logistics and human will over distance and deprivation. And in the middle of that triumph, a paradox. The same machinery designed for destruction also delivered a moment of grace. The smell of that coffee lingered long after the war ended, not as a taste of victory, but as a reminder of what civilization can endure, even in the sand and silence of war. To an American soldier, coffee was more than a drink. It was identity. At home, it filled diners at dawn and kitchen tables at dusk. It was the ritual that began every workday, every journey, every conversation. From the trenches of the First World War to the ship decks of the Second, coffee had followed the American fighting man like a faithful companion. The U.S. military understood this instinctively. Coffee represented normalcy, a small rebellion against the madness of war. In the freezing Ardennes or the blistering sands of Saipan, soldiers brewed coffee to remember who they were before they became instruments of war. For the Japanese, this act was alien. Their ritual drink was tea. Calm, ceremonial, precise. Tea was discipline. Coffee was freedom. To watch an American soldier gulp coffee from a dented canteen slouched against a sandbag seemed almost disrespectful to the solemnity of war. Yet there was something strangely powerful about it. A declaration that even here, amid ruin, life could remain casual, familiar. When Japanese prisoners saw their captors drink coffee under the sun, it wasn't just the beverage that startled them. It was what it represented. A culture that could stay human while fighting a total war. A society that waged destruction without fully surrendering its sense of comfort. That contrast would linger in Japanese memory for decades, shaping how they later understood American strength, not just in weapons, but in spirit. In the aftermath of the war, Allied intelligence and historians collected diaries and testimonies from captured Japanese officers and soldiers. Among them were scattered fragments, simple sentences written in disbelief. "They gave us hot drink. I could not believe. The enemy is strange. They kill fiercely, but then they feed us." These were not propaganda lines. They were human observations, reflections of a psychological collapse. Many prisoners had expected execution. Some begged for it. Others tried to refuse food and water, believing starvation more honorable. But the consistency of American discipline, the procedural kindness, slowly broke that fatalism. In one recorded account from Saipan, A Japanese medic wrote that a U.S. Marine had offered him coffee and a cigarette during processing. The medic described feeling ashamed to be treated kindly by such an enemy. That shame, a collision between honor and compassion, haunted many for years when interrogators asked why some soldiers surrendered instead of dying. They often cited exhaustion, but just as often they spoke of confusion. The idea that Americans could be both fierce and merciful challenged everything they had been told. This was psychological warfare without intention, a cultural confrontation deeper than any bomb crater. For some, that confusion became gratitude. For others, humiliation, but in all cases, it altered perception, the invisible battlefield of belief. In the war's final year, Japanese propaganda continued to insist that capture meant torture, but rumors spread among surviving soldiers that the Americans were not monsters. They offered food, they treated wounds, and sometimes they served hot coffee in the desert. On paper, coffee had no tactical value. It didn't win battles or capture ground, but in reality, it did something equally important. It sustained the will to fight, and sometimes the will to remain human. For American soldiers, especially in the Pacific, fatigue was the deadliest enemy. Endless heat, flies, disease, and the constant threat of ambush gnawed at morale. The caffeine in coffee sharpened minds, but the ritual of brewing it steadied souls. It marked the difference between chaos and order. Army psychologists noted that soldiers who maintained small routines, shaving, writing letters, making coffee, were less likely to suffer breakdowns. These habits, trivial on the surface, anchored men to reality amid destruction. Commanders noticed too. They encouraged rest periods and coffee breaks even at the front, recognizing that morale could win wars as surely as bullets. And there was another, quieter effect. When prisoners saw American soldiers calmly brewing coffee after battle, it projected an image of control, discipline under comfort, a power that did not need to shout. It told them, "We can fight you and still remain human." That message, though unspoken, carried through every encounter. Some historians have even suggested that these small gestures, warmth, organization, routine, indirectly influenced the conduct of later battles. Captured intelligence, gleaned from calmer, cooperative prisoners, often stemmed from the atmosphere of fairness and civility that acts like the coffee moment created. What began as a simple break in the desert became, in effect, a quiet form of psychological dominance, a moral confidence so strong it no longer needed cruelty to assert itself. The canteen of coffee, the soldier's ritual, the prisoner's silence, all were fragments of a single truth: that war reveals not only how nations destroy, but how they choose to remain human while doing so. And yet, there would come a moment when that fragile humanity would be tested to its limit. When survival, exhaustion, and conscience collided in one searing instant. Saipan, July 9, 1944. The island was burning after 3 weeks of brutal fighting. The last Japanese strongholds had fallen. The ridgelines were scarred with shell craters, and the smell of cordite clung to the wind. U.S. Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions advanced cautiously through fields of shattered coral, searching for the living among the dead. The Battle of Saipan was more than a fight for land. It was the collapse of an empire's illusion. Nearly 30,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Another 5,000 civilians had perished, some by suicide, leaping from the cliffs of Marpi Point, rather than face capture. For the first time in the Pacific, a large number of Japanese soldiers surrendered alive. It was not many, barely 1,000 out of tens of thousands, but it was enough to astonish both sides. On the morning after the fighting stopped, a temporary processing camp was set up near the island's southern plateau. The ground was dry, the air thick with heat. American engineers erected makeshift tents from canvas and bamboo poles. Barbed wire enclosed a rectangle of dust. Inside, the first groups of prisoners sat, dazed, their rifles long gone. They were men who had fought until they could no longer move. Some had been wounded and bandaged by American medics. Some still muttered fragments of orders, their minds lost in the battle's echo. They expected punishment or silence. They did not expect breakfast, but the American army ran on routine. Before dawn, field kitchens came alive. Corporal James Carver, a cook with the 106th Quartermaster Company, later wrote in his diary that he brewed the biggest pot of coffee I'd ever made. The boys looked half dead, and I guess the prisoners did too. He didn't set out to make history. He simply followed the manual. The M1937 range burned steady under the desert wind. Buckets of water, purified with chlorine, boiled and steamed. Into the pot went pounds of instant coffee. Bitter, dark, strong. The scent drifted across the wire, curling into the morning air. A few Japanese soldiers turned their heads. One blinked as if he were hallucinating. Another whispered something. Kuhi, the foreign word unfamiliar, yet strangely gentle. Carver filled a row of metal cups, handed them to a corporal who walked toward the wire. The guard hesitated. It wasn't in any manual to serve prisoners before they were processed, but he shrugged and pushed a cup through. The first prisoner didn't move. He stared at it as if it were an explosive. Then slowly he reached out, his hand trembling. He lifted it to his lips, the steam clouding his face, and took a sip. A pause. Then another. Something shifted in the air. A silence that wasn't fear anymore, but recognition. One soldier, still bandaged around the head, bowed slightly before drinking. Another looked up at the American on the other side of the wire and murmured a word that no one understood, but everyone felt. The Marines stood watching, unsure what to say. A few joined in, pouring coffee for themselves. No orders were given, no speeches made. Just a quiet, spontaneous ritual between enemies who, for one strange moment, were simply men enduring the same sun. Photographs taken that day by military correspondents show a surreal contrast. Prisoners sitting cross-legged in the sand, American soldiers standing behind them, both groups holding identical cups. The horizon blurs in the heat, and for once, no one is pointing a weapon. Later, those photos would circulate through military intelligence briefings, labeled example of humane treatment. But for the men who lived it, it was simpler than that. As one Marine later recalled, they weren't our friends. They weren't our enemies anymore either. Just men, and we were tired. That morning, no one knew how many more battles awaited. Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, nor how much blood would still be spilled. But in that instant, amid the dust and the coffee steam, the machinery of hate faltered. War, for a heartbeat, had stopped behaving like war. The sound of waves in the distance, the hum of generators, and the soft clinking of metal cups. This was the closest thing to peace that men on Saipan would know for months. But peace in war is never permanent. What began as an unplanned act of decency would ripple far beyond that camp, influencing not only how prisoners behaved, but how the U.S. military approached every encounter afterward. The moment of coffee in the desert had planted an idea, and like all powerful ideas, it would soon prove to have consequences no one expected. In the days following the fall of Saipan, word of the coffee incident, as it was later quietly called among the guards, began to spread. No one recorded it as official policy, yet stories traveled quickly in war. Soldiers wrote home about it. Marines told replacements on the next transport ship. Even intelligence officers who dealt with captured men daily noticed something shift in tone. The Japanese prisoners at Saipan had behaved differently from those taken earlier in the war. They were more subdued, less hostile. Many still refused to speak, but a few began to answer questions, simple ones, about unit designations, supply routes, or conditions in the caves. Not through coercion, but fatigue and faint trust. Reports from the Allied Translator and Interpreter section, ATIS in the Pacific Theater noted a distinct psychological transition among prisoners captured in the Marianas. They were not cooperating out of allegiance, but confusion. Their expectations of cruelty had been contradicted by reality. In one ATS memo from August 1944, a linguist recorded a curious exchange. A prisoner stated that he believed Americans must have been deceived by propaganda too, that surely Japanese soldiers were good men. He could not understand why. If America hated Japan, they would offer them warmth and food. It was not confession. It was awakening. In the complex geometry of war, such moments had quiet but measurable effects. Intelligence reports grew more detailed, more accurate. Medical staff noted fewer suicides among new prisoners. Camp discipline improved. Some of this was deliberate. The U.S. command recognized the value of humane treatment, but much of it stemmed from a subtle moral contagion. A gesture, repeated enough times, begins to define behavior. When prisoners were shipped from Saipan to Hawaii, they carried with them stories of that camp, of the strange Americans who served hot coffee and called them Sir. In subsequent interrogations, when these men spoke to new captives, they often described what they had experienced. One account from 1945 recalls a group of new POWs at Guam whispering that the enemy treats us like men. For the Japanese command, this was catastrophic. Their propaganda machine depended on the belief that surrender meant torture. Once that belief cracked, fear itself, the cornerstone of resistance, began to weaken. No general order could undo what one act of decency had begun. At the same time, among American troops, the moment had its own internal echo. Combat fatigue was real. Men who had endured weeks of relentless fighting needed reminders that they were still human, that their duty did not demand cruelty. In field reports, chaplains often described small moral gestures as anchors against dehumanization. A cup of coffee, a bandaged wound, a shared cigarette. These were, in the words of one Navy chaplain, the slender bridges back to sanity. The Saipan coffee became one such bridge. The Quartermaster Corps even referenced it informally in later training materials, examples of morale maintenance in forward areas. None of this meant that war suddenly grew gentle. Within months, the campaigns of Peleliu and Iwo Jima would show the Pacific at its most merciless. Yet, among the survivors of Saipan, a strange truth persisted. The men who had offered coffee that day remembered it more vividly than any victory. One Marine, years later, was asked in an interview what stuck with him from Saipan. He didn't mention the shelling or the carnage. He said, "It's funny what stays with you. We fought them hard. We killed a lot of them. But I can still see that one guy sitting in the sand holding that cup like it was something holy." War records can measure casualties and tonnage, but not that. Not the moment when an act of mercy becomes a fault line in history. As Japan's empire crumbled and the tide of battle rolled ever closer to the homeland, such stories multiplied. At Guam, at Tinian, at Luzon, everywhere the Americans established camps, the same scenes reappeared. Food, water, routine, order. And always, somewhere, coffee. To the U.S. military, it was procedure. To the prisoners, it was revelation. In 1945, when Japanese civilians on the home islands first heard reports from returning POWs about the Americans' conduct, they refused to believe it. But the truth could not be suppressed forever. It became one of the first cracks in the myth of the enemy, a small but vital step toward post-war reconciliation. That day on Saipan, when the sun burned over the wire and the smell of roasted beans drifted across the sand, no one could have known how far its echo would travel. It would shape interrogations, inspire field manuals, and linger in memory long after the guns fell silent. And when the war finally ended, that same ritual, hot coffee served to the defeated, would reappear once more, this time in the ashes of Japan itself. The desert was only the beginning. By late 1944, the Pacific had become a war of attrition, not just in men and machines, but in minds. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa would soon dwarf Saipan's horror, but the lessons learned there about surrender, treatment, and the strange power of compassion would quietly influence everything that followed. The Japanese prisoners taken at Saipan were transported first to Guam, then to camps in Hawaii and the U.S. mainland. To the Americans, they were data points, potential intelligence sources. To themselves, they were living contradictions. Men who had been told that capture was a sin now found themselves alive, fed, and clothed by the enemy. Their days followed a pattern of strict order. Roll call, meals, work details, language classes. But the small gestures mattered more than the routines. Every morning, the same smell of coffee drifted across the camp. At first, many prisoners ignored it. Then, one by one, they began to accept it, cautiously, silently. It became the unspoken ritual that marked the day, bridging two worlds without words. American guards noticed. Reports from the U.S. Army Provost Marshal General's Office in WWII 1945 documented unusually low rates of resistance among Japanese POWs compared to German prisoners in Europe. There were suicides, yes, but also quiet cooperation. Prisoners began assisting with translations, constructing airfields, even helping to write Japanese-language leaflets urging others to surrender. Psychologists studying these camps concluded that the prisoners' mental states had been transformed not by propaganda, but by contrast. The contrast between what they were told America was and what they actually saw. It was not kindness in the sentimental sense. It was discipline, structure, and respect. A form of moral control that demanded no loyalty, only acknowledgement. And yet, for many prisoners, that acknowledgement turned into reflection. Letters written from U.S. camps, now archived in Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies, contain haunting confessions. I thought I was dead when captured, but they gave me food, water, and something hot to drink. I began to question everything I believed. We were not treated as beasts. It is shameful and also comforting. When the war ended in August 1945, thousands of these men returned home, not as heroes, but as outcasts. Their families often refused to speak of them. Some hid their status for decades, but privately they carried memories that conflicted with the empire's narrative. A few wrote memoirs in the 1950s and 60s, recalling the paradox of their captivity. They described the moment of drinking American coffee, not as a humiliation, but as a revelation. One former infantryman wrote, "It was the first time I realized the Americans fought to win, not to hate." Historians today regard these reflections as early signs of Japan's post-war re-evaluation of its military code. The slow erosion of Bushidō, as a national ideology. The POW experience, especially under American custody, forced an entire generation to confront what had been taken for granted, that mercy was weakness and death was honor. The Saipan coffee moment became, in that sense, a symbol of a greater transformation, one that reached from the barren Pacific Islands to the heart of Japan's reconstruction. But that transformation did not happen overnight. It took years of rebuilding, diplomacy, and quiet human contact before former enemies could look each other in the eye and see something familiar. And in the ruins of post-war Japan, as American troops now occupied the homeland they had once bombed, that same gesture, offering hot coffee to the defeated, would return once more. When Japan formally surrendered on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, the world believed the Pacific War had ended. But for the people who had lived it, the struggle to understand what it meant had only begun. Tokyo was a wasteland. Entire districts lay in ashes from months of firebombing. Trains barely ran, food was scarce, and millions were displaced. Into this devastation came American occupation forces, soldiers, engineers, and administrators, many of whom had fought through the islands where those same prisoners had once been captured. The mission now was not conquest, but reconstruction. And once again, the instruments of that effort were not weapons, but habits, discipline, organization, and, often, the same quiet rituals that had sustained them in war. Coffee was among the first commodities to reappear in Japan's black markets. American GIs brought it with them, served it from field kitchens and mobile canteens as they distributed aid and supplies. To the Japanese civilians, exhausted and hungry, the smell was foreign yet strangely comforting. The scent of a different kind of power, one that did not destroy, but rebuilt. Newspapers from late 1945 described crowds gathering near U.S. bases, where soldiers handed out food, chocolate, and cups of steaming coffee. Photographs show women and children holding tin mugs, smiling shyly at uniformed men who months earlier had been their enemies. To the Japanese, this was bewildering. How could the same nation that burned their cities now offer warmth and civility? The answer lay not in contradiction, but in continuity. The same military ethos that had built field kitchens on Saipan now powered feeding stations in Tokyo. The same procedural humanity that treated prisoners with order now guided occupation policy. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters emphasized that Japan must not be humiliated, but re-educated. Not broken, but rebuilt. This philosophy, deeply controversial at the time, drew strength from the understanding that lasting peace required dignity on both sides. For the Americans, the occupation became a test of restraint. For the Japanese, it became a rediscovery of trust. And between them, as small as it seemed, coffee often served as a bridge. In schools, offices, and factories rebuilt under American supervision, coffee became part of daily life, first as a novelty, then as a norm. It was served in post-war cafes that symbolized modernity and internationalism. The drink that had once marked the enemy became a symbol of progress, openness, and renewal. Decades later, historians looking back would trace subtle cultural threads from the battlefield to the peace that followed. The canteen coffee of Saipan, the occupation coffee of Tokyo, both moments belong to the same story. The assertion of humanity through small, consistent acts of civility. For the American veterans who returned in the 1950s as tourists or businessmen, Japan was almost unrecognizable. A modern, peaceful nation whose people now embraced many aspects of Western life. Some of those men would sit in Ginza cafes, sipping coffee brewed by baristas trained in American methods, unaware that the ritual before them had once bridged an empire and its fall. Letters and oral histories from those veterans reveal a quiet pride, not in victory, but in the endurance of decency. One Marine wrote in 1963, "I never thought much about that coffee we gave those prisoners, but sometimes I wonder, maybe that's the only thing from the war I'd want remembered." And in a way, it was remembered. Not as a military triumph, but as a human one. The proof that civilization could survive even amid the ruins it created. The war had begun with surprise attacks, atrocities, and unimaginable destruction. It ended in countless small moments like that one, with gestures that restored something fragile yet enduring. Dignity. But even dignity, like steam from a cup, fades unless we learn from it. History often remembers wars through explosions, battles, surrenders, treaties. But the soul of war is found in smaller things. The sound of a match striking against wind. The smell of coffee rising from tin. The trembling hand of a prisoner reaching for warmth. The Pacific War was fought with unimaginable ferocity. It devoured cities, oceans, and generations. Yet, within that chaos, moments of grace survived. Brief flickers that revealed what even war could not destroy. Humanity's stubborn will to remain human. The coffee shared on Saipan was not a treaty, not a political act. It was a pause, an unplanned stillness in which enemies saw each other not as symbols, but as men. In that moment, power did not come from rifles or ranks, but from restraint, from the choice to offer rather than to harm. When the U.S. Army canteen poured steaming liquid into a prisoner's hands, it carried more than coffee. It carried the entire weight of civilization, the belief that even in a world collapsing into violence, decency was not negotiable. That belief would shape the peace to come. From the ruins of the Pacific to the reconstruction of Japan, it endured, not as ideology, but as memory, a memory that whispered, "We are more than what war makes of us." Today, few remember the names of the men on that ridge or the cooks who brewed that pot. But their silence, the quiet between them, still speaks. It tells us that mercy, when extended without expectation, can echo further than victory. And that even in the deserts of war, when the world seems stripped of meaning, something as simple as a cup of hot coffee can remind us what it means to be civilized.